Hi there, I'm Lou, and today I'm going to be talking about using the Visual Studio Code ROS extension over SSH. Now this is really useful if you have a nice big desktop or a laptop and you want to connect to a remote system like my trusty little JetBot here. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to set this up, including how to use SSH keys, installing the Visual Studio Code remote extension pack, actually connecting to a remote system, and installing the remote extension on the remote server. But before I begin, there's a couple of concepts that I want to cover and actually to demonstrate how this works end to end. When you install Visual Studio Code, you're actually installing two different pieces. You have the UI that runs on the local computer, and if you're running it only on the local computer, you won't notice that there's actually a separate process here. When running the SSH extension, what it does is it actually establishes an SSH channel between your local computer and a remote computer. And this is a secure channel that all of the Visual Studio Code traffic runs over. During that initial connection, it's going to install a remote server on that remote computer. And that server process actually is responsible for all of your debugging, local file open, as well as IntelliSense and other things. So when you establish that connection, you now need to install extensions remotely. I'll show two methods for installing the Visual Studio Code ROS extension in this remote system, but it is actually running on that remote computer. It doesn't have any concept that there's another system. When the ROS extension serves up UI, it actually serves it up as HTML that gets rendered in that local computer process. So once you have the Visual Studio Code extension installed running on this remote computer, you open a workspace. You're actually working on the remote workspace, so opening files on that remote system. When you compile code, you're using the local scripts. In fact, the Visual Studio Code ROS extension will reach out, set up ROS that's running on that remote system, so you don't even have to have ROS running on the system that you're connecting to it from. This works on Windows, Linux, and I'm told it works on Mac, but I haven't tested it yet. So let's go ahead and talk about how to set this up. In order to establish a connection between your local system and your remote system, we're going to use SSH keys. Now, SSH keys have a public key and a private key. Private key stays private, but you can hand out the public key remotely. This is a way of asserting my identity on that remote system so that I can make connections without a password. It works very similarly between Windows and Linux. Commands are slightly different, but I'll show both of them at the same time. I am using WSL for this, but it can work Linux bare metal or on Mac as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a SSH folder in my user profile directory. So make dir user profile SSH, and I will just paste it for reference. I'm going to, Windows installs SSH server by default, so you actually have quite a bit of tooling available without having to install it. So I'm going to use SSH keygen and create a new identity that I'm just calling Xavier, because that's what I'm going to be connecting to. For this, I'm just going to press enter, no passcode needed. This random art image is kind of interesting, worth looking up. So now that I actually have an SSH key pair, both public and private, I need to get my public key remotely. There is a file that I need to create on the remote system called an authorized keys, and that is how the remote server is going to know that I am making the connection. On Windows, you use type instead of cat, but we're actually going to type the file locally and pipe it into SSH, ultimately concatenating it into the authorized key file. So this is how this command works. Now, the first time I'm making a connection, it says, I don't know this computer. Is this the right one? It's the only computer on the network, so I'm going to type yes. And I'm going to type my password. Now, what this has done is it's copied my private or public key to the remote system so it can insert an identity. Now that I've done that, the next step is actually to create a config that says, I just want to use this name to refer to this remote computer. So I'm going to config. Now this is a blank file. That has nothing in it, but I'm going to create a host entry. The host is Xavier, so this is how I'm going to refer to it, just like you would do Microsoft.com or whatever. The host name is a static IP address that I've assigned to the system, the user account, and the file that I want to use locally. Now, interestingly enough, SSH will turn this tilde SSH folder into the local user profile so that it'll just work. So I'm going to switch back to the terminal and go ahead and SSH to Xavier. And there I go. I'm connected remotely. Now we're going to switch over to the Linux side, and you can see that it's very similar. So first, I want to make sure I have a SSH directory. I'm going to generate the keygen very similar to the way I did on Windows. You'll notice it's a different type of key. And I'm going to authorize it. Now, this one also says that it can't establish the identity. That's okay. And there I go. It has copied the new private key over. I'm going to use the same host file, so nano-ssh config, and paste that. Control S, Control X, and now I can do SSH Xavier. And then we've connected. And what this has done is it makes it easy for me to make a connection from a local system to that remote system in a file that VS Code can now access. So now let's switch over to VS Code and set up the remote extension. So now we're going to install the remote extension in Visual Studio Code. To do this, from Visual Studio Code, select the Extensions tab and look for Remote Extension Pack. We're going to select the remote extension using the universal icon of two arrows that aren't connecting to each other. This includes 3 different extensions, one for remote WSL, one for containers, and one for SSH. Now once this is installed, you'll see that we now have that universal connection icon of 2 not connecting arrows. We're going to connect this current window to the host. Now, you can if you select connect to host, it'll create a new window, or you can use the current window. Now, when you select that, you'll notice that the config file that we have with Xavier is already here, so I can select that. It will now open the config file and attempt to make a connection. Now, if you're on Windows, there's a firewall prompt might be displayed saying, hey, do you actually want to access this? The remote system is Linux, so we're going to select that. And you can see that is now installing that Visual Studio Code server remotely. Go ahead and close that. Now, we are actually connected remotely to this system. I can open a folder. For example, my workspace, I have the Onyx Runtime workspace here. I'm going to go ahead and trust the authors of this. And this is a ROS1 Catkin workspace. Now, I don't actually have the Visual Studio Code remote extension installed, so I'm going to show 2 different methods to install this. The first is I'm going to select the Extensions tab and search for ROS, find the one by Microsoft, and click Install. This is installing that remote extension into the remote computer so that we can use ROS remotely. You'll see that it is it's installing it now. While it's doing that, I'm going to show you a second method. If you go to File, Preferences, Settings, and look for SSH, you can see that there is default extensions here. If you select the Add Item, you can put the name of an extension in here. So for the remote extension, I'll select this little icon here, copy the extension ID, go to Settings, select Add Item, and paste it in here. MSIOT-Visual Studio Code ROS. So what this will do is anytime you make an SSH connection, it will automatically install this. Okay, so that's a tip. If you're not using ROS on every connection, probably don't want to install the extension everywhere. But this is a helpful activity or helpful setting if all you do is remote connections with ROS. Okay, and you can see that now that it's restarted, the Visual Studio Code ROS extension has detected that this is Noetic. You can press Control-Shift-P, search for ROS, create terminal, and now this is a ROS terminal that's running remotely on the computer. And you can do whatever ROS commands you want here. Anyway, I hope you find this useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell your friends. Thanks a lot.